Hello, Ed Barnhart. Welcome to my channel.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. So nice to talk to an archaeologist. We're kind of outnumbered here on the internet.
Well, I'm actually a geologist, but I do study a lot of um, the work I do is studying how climate impacts societies, but I'm on the side of the paleoclimate record generating side. I've become a lot more interested in the archaeology side. And that's why I wanted to talk to you today because you've had a very interesting career and I've followed some of the videos you've been putting out over maybe the course of the last year or two. I first saw you on Lex Friedman's podcast,
Yeah.
which he's an inspiration for this channel. And so I kind of have followed you since then. You did like a Maya Wired download. I think Maya download is what they called it on Wired.
But what did they call they called it like Maya tech support.
Oh yeah, Maya tech support, and then your channel, which was really nice and cool. I saw the most recent one was Cahokia, and we've shared some of my research with Cahokia. So I watched that, and that was a interesting video, very well done. And I think the way you narrate it and bring up Mound 72 and incorporate it into the whole site, which is really nice because Mound 72. Maybe we'll talk about that. We should talk about that later in Cahokia in a little bit more detail. But I think if someone's clicking on this link to watch this video, it's because they're a fan of you and they want to hear about you. And I want to hear about you because right now I'm focusing on getting scientists on YouTube, like that have done interesting work, but some of them don't have any social media presence. And you have a big presence, I would say, relatively speaking. And so I want to start with your story. And I actually started to get into it a little bit. You went to UT Austin, and I'll let you tell me more. You did your PhD in 2001, you finished?
Yep, that was a long time ago now, almost 20.
Yeah. Gee, I don't mean to say, yeah, that was like that, but 25 years ago.
It's all right.
I
I
was
mean,
in eighth grade, or seventh grade. So it does seem like kind of like yesterday in a way.
well, one
But
of the advantages of age is experience. So, I have been around the block.
in your early years, you did your when you were doing your research in grad school, you made an interesting discovery. You actually talk about it on your channel. You discovered the city of Mahashna, if I said that right.
In Maya, it's Mahashna.
Mahashna, Mahashna. Okay.
I'm terrible at it too, but I tried to. The apostrophe is in there because it's a glottal stop in Maya language. That's the word monkey, and it's something like maash.
Oh, okay. Can you tell us about that discovery, discovering that in the jungle? Tell us about it. When did it start? And how did you find that city?
Man, I was lucky, and it really was a dream come true. I was this funny high school kid who got it in my head that there were a lot more undiscovered ancient cities to find out there, and I was going to do that. So I had this kind of, borderline irrational life plan that I would go out and find undiscovered ancient cities. And, I
Awesome.
thought it was going to be South America back then. I studied lots of books about South America. I ended up going to the University of Colorado, where, to my surprise, there were no South America archaeologist professors. I had this ignorant idea that it was such a big university that I'd find every topic under the sun. I didn't. But I found a professor that was doing Maya stuff, and he was Payson Sheets was his name, and I knew nothing about the Maya. But as I took his class, I realized, boy, that's a whole nother undiscovered world. And as fate would have it, there was a field school that brought people to the Maya world, and I did that. I fell in love with it, and so when I went for my graduate studies in the University of Texas, I was really still hanging on to this dream that we can and should find ancient cities. And I ended up getting in the graduate department there at anthropology. And we had this huge area of Belize to survey that no archaeologists had ever surveyed. There were rangers out there. The land came into public domain, owned by the government because it was a huge area that Coca-Cola had bought, and they were going to, excuse me, they were going to chop down the entire area and make it an orange grove. And of course, there was international pushback on that. And to save face, Coca-Cola donated it to Belize. And that's how I ended up in this area, this huge area that had been virtually unsurveyed. And so this was back in the early 90s. And so, cell phones didn't exist yet. GPS existed, but it was crap. And so we were very much, in the old school world. I had topography maps and machetes and students. And so, but I played the game of, if I was a Maya, where in this big area would I want to put a city? And I thought about a lot of the art history classes and religion classes I had studied at University of Texas under Linda Sheely, and said, okay, they call every pyramid a tun wheats, a stone mountain. And they really, they originated, the Maya, the earliest Maya are up in the mountains in Guatemala. So they care about mountains. Where is the tallest mountain in this area, called Program for Belize? And so I looked at all the topography maps that I had ordered through the mail and found this one big peak that was bigger than all the other peaks in the area. I said, that's a good spot. But when I looked at it more, there were two other little mountains right next to it, and they made kind of a triangle. And in a valley in between them, there were three rivers, at least on the map. I honestly never found any of those rivers. But
Cars?
with the triangle there, that's like the formation of a lot of the Maya plazas that are these three temples. Tikal's one of the best examples, but Palenque has one. Tons of these triadic formations of pyramids. And so I was like, well, that looks just like the kind of landscape they would like. So that's where we hiked out. And over 2 seasons, we finally made our way out to the first of those three peaks. And luckily, that's where I found the city. It wasn't on that tall peak. There's stuff out there too. But the city itself was luckily on the first peak I crossed. It was kind of a plateau on top. And there was a big Maya city sitting there with pyramids. The tallest one's 25 meters tall. There's a palace, there's a plaza, there's a ball court. To my frustration, I never found them, but subsequent studies have also found stela there. I was dying to find a stela, and when I saw where they found it, I was like, oh my God, I walked past that and thought it was a rock for, it must have been 20 times I walked past a stela and didn't know it was one.
Wow. Tell us what it was like walking into the site and knowing you're walking into a Maya site. It's all connected at that moment. You're the first researchers in there with machetes, so there's no trails. Tell us what that was like.
The day that we found it, there were 8 of us. There was me as the director, and then students and one very old gentleman who had gone back to school. He was my partner. But we spread out like we always did. We found a building that was pretty big, actually. It was 4 meters tall, bigger than a house for sure. And we thought, that's weird. Okay, this is exciting. Let's take this on our graph paper and spread out. We sent one group north, west, east, south. And so the western one, I was the southern one. The western one, they start yelling my name. And I thought they had gotten bitten by a snake or something. So I go running across the jungle to get to them. And it turns out that they're standing way up above my head on a 17-meter tall, not exactly pyramid. It was a range building. So it had a lot more volume, but it was 17 meters tall. And they were standing up there just cheering. And I mean, there it was. I could see the stones of the terraces going up the back, and we had found our first huge building. But we're in the middle of a jungle, so you can't see anything. Just because, I had to be at the base of this building looking up to realize that they were on a building. So I went back and collected everybody else, and we got up on top and we had our lunch for the day.
Nice.
And we discussed what our plan would be now. Okay, we're sitting on top of a pyramid. What the heck else is here? And that's where the city got its name too.
Spider monkey or
howler monkey is, there's another word for spider monkey. Howler monkey is ma'ash.
Oh, okay.
And all of these howler monkeys just came down on the top of the pyramid and were yelling and screaming like over us. We had to like raise our voices to talk to each other because they wouldn't stop screaming at us. And it was a big troop. And usually, there's just one or two that are like the bulls yell, not everybody else. But this was like the whole troop was up in arms and talking to us. That's where I said, okay, this is their home, not ours. We're going to name this after them. And that's how it got Monkey House.
Jeez. Yeah,
But
that's
so we finished our lunch and we said, well, we came from the east and we would have noticed if we were walking through a plaza, and we weren't. So if we are in a plaza, it's got to be to our west. So we scrambled down the west side of this temple and spread out again. And it was clear that it was flat when we got down there, but then quickly into it, somebody yelled that there was another pyramid on the other side. Somebody yelled that they were in a ball court. Somebody yelled that they were in a palace-like structure. So within a 30 minutes after we finished our lunch, that's when we really realized, okay, we've done it. We've got a plaza 100 meters across, surrounded in pyramids. We've actually found a city.
I know what you mean by how thick the jungle is there. I was in Belize. I went to some of the sites closer to the coast, but I can't imagine just cutting my way through the jungle out there, especially because there seems to be a lot more things that could kill you, a lot more poisonous things, snakes and what have you. And there's jaguars but I think from watching your video, you followed previous English logging roads to get to the site partially, right?
That's right. That was the decision I made. Traditionally in archaeology, when you're in some impenetrable unknown area like that, you follow transects. You follow a straight line and you kind of like cut the jungle with like it's pieces of graph paper. You're following the lines of the graph paper so you can map things off of a line that's cut, which we call a transect. But our line kept running into these dang logging roads, and the logging roads were following the path of least resistance through the hills. So whereas like from the main dirt road to the first time we hit the logging road, there are 7 big hills that we have to go up and over and up and over, and it was really hard cutting. Some of them were ravines and straight up and straight down. And then when we found the logging road, we said, that's interesting. We kept doing our transect and we went over another big hill down and hit the same logging road again. So that's when I thought, like, okay, well, let's just take a day and follow this logging road and see where it goes. And it followed this much easier path right back to the main road where our truck was. When we popped out, we were maybe, 300 meters away from our truck. And we were like, well, that's easier. Ultimately, I used those roads to cut them out completely and drive a truck 5 kilometers into the jungle to the site of Mahashna. And if I had not used those roads, I would have never done that. I wouldn't have been able to do that. A transect going straight in could not have planned out a way to get a vehicle in. But with the logging roads, I could. So it just made sense. There was a time where both the graduate students that were there and my professor were pushing back on me a lot. Like, listen, when you just follow the logging roads, you're just like wandering through the forest. But ultimately, my logging road stopped at Mahashna. So, and the funny thing is that these were logging roads from the British, like over 100 years before. So they were super grown over, and the British could care less about the ruins. In fact, they didn't even see them. I found a couple of logging roads where they had busted through a Maya building, like creamed half of it, and didn't dig into it at all. They just they didn't even recognize what it was. They thought, well, this is an inconvenient hill in this flat spot. We'll just cut
Yeah.
through this.
They wouldn't have
So
had
they
any.
they they made me a road without messing with the ruins. Kind of perfect.
Wow. It makes you wonder how they figured that out, but maybe they just followed contours around hillsides because of gradients and what have you, like they did for the railroads. And
They
like,
absolutely did. This was an industry. They were in there to get mahogany, which, in the 1800s, Europe filled with mahogany furniture that was all from the big forests of Central America and Mexico. Sadly, most of that was logged out. That's why they left. They couldn't find any more big trees. There's very little mahogany in there.
Tell us about the site itself. So, when is it dated to, and how many people do you think lived there?
Those are both good questions. I did the mapping, and then I was on to Palenque. But in subsequent years, field schools have gone and done excavations. We're pretty sure that the city is in the time period we call terminal classic. So the classic Maya civilization has fallen apart, and there are a few little communities that are or cities that are growing up in the vacuum of kingly leadership. They're now back to kind of struggling with their normal council systems. There were leaders, but they were collective, not a single despotic king. So its time period is terminal classic. Now that could change if enough excavation happens there. If they dig deep enough into these range buildings that are in the main plaza, they might find earlier stuff. Uh,
And so, do you
Go ahead.
think the end of this settlement, then, if it's at the end, the Terminal Classic, that's when the drought hit at the end from the Hodel group and
Yeah,
and yeah, right?
that is the time period where the drought would be affecting things.
Yeah, so that's interesting that, and this is in a kind of a topographically elevated watershed too, where there could be water issues with a dry spell.
You're absolutely right. I enjoy your perspective on that. Maybe that was even though I never found those rivers, they were on my topography map. Perhaps that was one of the decisions for the placement of that city. The drought thing too, it's tricky. You're probably much more versed than I am on it. But especially in the Maya world, it's such a huge place. It's got coastal areas, it's got lowland places next to huge rivers, and it's got the highlands. So, the dynamics that caused the collapse of Maya society are not known to us. We have a whole lot of theories and factors that led in, but no clear this is why it happened. So the drought theory works very well in certain places and is falls short in others.
Right. The Maya don't seem to, when we say collapse, they don't leave the area. They move to different areas. They move to different regions of the Maya lowland in Mexico, Central America. But it seems like there were some, like, what is it? Negras was a site, I think.
Yeah, that's one on the Usamascinta River.
Yeah, which is still kind of, it was abandoned. It's still abandoned today. But does seem to be a handful of the sites that were in water sensitive areas, let's say, that could be where drought could be a bigger factor playing into the economy, let's say, of that like local Mayan settlement. And remind me,
I think lower rainfall was probably a challenge for everybody, but you bring up an interesting example. Piedras Negras is right along the Usamascinta River, and no one would argue that dried up. So they did have a perennial source of water. Now, that in that particular ruins case, the city was some 70, 80 meters above the water, even when it was high. They put themselves way up high above the water, but they had water. I mean, and it was kind of oxbowing through the area too. So it was certainly within the Maya capacity to, you know, do channel systems, other kinds of hydro engineering to face that challenge. And just because the city was in one spot doesn't mean that's where their crops were. I don't even know where their crops were. But in any event, it does. Now, maybe you can enlighten me on this. I mean, there are a number of Maya cities that collapsed sitting right next to huge water sources. Would they still have been suffering the effects of drought enough to say, well, we're going to have to abandon this huge metropolis we made?
I think it's a complicated answer. It's a combination of the soil and the hydrology. And I think a good case study is El Mirador. So El Mirador has all these clay layers. So The jungle used to have this beautiful organic rich soil around El Mirador. And after all the deforestation and agriculture, this seemed to have washed away, and all these, like they call them sterile clays, were exposed. So when you have that kind of soil doesn't hold water, and you just alter the soil hydrology so much that it might even amplify the hydroclimate story. So you have loss of soils with the combined drought, and that's
So
enough to
kind of a
make.
perfect storm where they were already kind of irresponsibly overusing the land, and then the drought happens and they're in a real hole.
Right, kind of like the what we did in Oklahoma, western Kansas during the Dust Bowl.
You know, I've read interesting studies. There was actually a government study, like the US government study, I think it's all the way back in the 80s, that was proposing that a lot of the cradles of civilization today that are now kind of barren wastelands were turned into those barren wastelands by the first intensive agriculture attempted by those civilizations, that they ultimately got smart, but that the first couple of times they just destroyed the humus layer, basically like accidentally salted the earth, and they screwed up these environments. And I had a scientist who was on a trip of mine years ago who was asking me kind of intelligent questions in this regard about Yucatan and how Yucatan soil so sucks. Like, is it possible that, the early attempts of agriculture were actually a precipitating factor in permanently ruining the the agricultural potential of that area? Just like you were mentioning in El Mirador, where it was probably pretty fertile, but they intensively agriculture, they overdid it, and they didn't, they eventually learned to rotate crops, to protect things, to do slash and burn. But once you rip the humus layer off of an area, it's really super hard to get it back.
But yeah, it takes hundreds, thousands of years. That's how it got there in the first place.
So it's interesting. I think a hypothesis that should be on the table when it comes to the early cities like El Mirador is, were they going through growing pains, learning how to feed a population permanently with intensive agriculture, and screwed it up early? And then the classic period learned new techniques like chinampas and other things to try to not destroy their environment.
I'm glad you brought up the distinction. El Mirador is early, what is it, pre-classic? So it's almost
One
a
of the
different
earliest cities we know of for the
earliest
Maya.
is, and um, Dante, the big pyramid is there. It's huge. I actually talked to Richard Hansen on this channel about it. It was pretty cool. I was like, wow. And he was so great to talk to. And a lot of people have commented, get him back on, because I do want to talk to him again.
Well,
But I
he's
think
so charismatic. He
yeah,
won
he
the
is.
Order of the Quetzal Award from Guatemala. That's the highest honor you can get in Guatemala as a foreigner.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, he was so I think this is an example of, so El Mirador, yeah, they're learning. So that city kind of collapsed or disintegrated. And the reason it remained abandoned was because of the loss of the soil. So the rains could have returned to normal. But at that point, it was Richard Hansen, just his feeling is the soils were gone, and it's in this basin, and thus it was abandoned, and took centuries for like the growth to come back. And I think then this is the case where you're saying, like, the Maya, when we talk about they collapsed, it's really the social hierarchies and the religious structures and the incentives collapse. The people flee, and it seems like they fled El Mirador and just didn't come back to the core of El Mirador. They went to new sites and maybe used these new ideas and were more persistent. But centuries later, at the end of the Terminal Classic, another big drought hits. And, you might learn enough, but you need food and you need wood to burn. And if your populations are growing, you're going to resist it as much as you can. Even today, we're so aware of how bad it can be to exploit the environment. We still do it because we need our resources. Uh,
Or we're just stuck living where we're living. I mean, all those people that are along the coasts of the world who we know we should evacuate now, when climate change is pushing sea level rise, we're not going to be able to do it. The Maya may have suffered the same sort of just regular Joe resistance. Like, no,
Mm,
I'm not moving. We've always lived here.
yeah, yeah, definitely. And just, yeah, being stuck to
Now,
the lane.
it's interesting. I am admittedly biased by all of my art history and anthropology stuff about the Maya, but I find it interesting. You just brought it up. Like, El Mirador was a huge city. It was it did spoil its agriculture productivity. But eventually that would come back and people that live in that environment would know it. Why didn't they ever go back to the city? To me, it smacks of another either, religious or just, you know, philosophical way of looking at the world. I think that the Maya repeatedly abandoned these cities, not just for practical reasons, but also for like spiritual and perhaps calendrical timing reasons.
Mm,
And
interesting.
so, I think that, if I try to put myself in the mindset of the Maya, something like agricultural productivity dropping might have been not entirely practically viewed, but also saying, well, the writing's on the wall. The gods are saying that, our time here has ended. We should go somewhere else. They are affecting our world in a way that's a signal that it is time for, like the Maya love to say, transformation and renewal. So, the Tikal is not very far away from El Mirador. And I mean, arguably, it's in an even worse environment to start up a big agricultural community, especially in the time that it did, because there are no rivers there whatsoever. They dig these incredible reservoirs, and I believe, and somebody will shoot me down if I'm wrong, but I believe also one of the things that Tikal did successfully is raised field agriculture. That was one of the adaptations. I think that when the Maya lived way up in the mountains at like where Guatemala City is now, there was a certain kind of agriculture. You could do terracing agriculture. You had uh, a different kind of rainfall. You had more perennial sources of water up there that were in spring form or in lakes. But when they got down to the lowlands, those same techniques were not applied. And perhaps a place like El Mirador, ran itself aground trying to use old techniques. Tikal comes around and comes up with some new techniques, like not that Tikal started them, but raised field agriculture becomes a very common Maya strategy to not destroy the land. So yeah, I think that I lost my thread there, but I guess what I was going for was I think when we're thinking about the Maya, we can't totally think practically. Like just because there is truth that their agricultural productivity got cratered at El Mirador, their thinking for abandoning it for good might not have been solely practical. It might have also been spiritual, cosmological, calendrical, like our time here is ended. An interesting thing about the Maya calendar is that that pre-classic collapse that transforms into the classic, that happens right around the turn of the ninth Bakhtun. And that age of the classic period, age of kings, I like to call it, goes on for 400 years. And then at the dawn of the 10th Bakhtun, all of those cities are abandoned. And I'm not saying that drought wasn't a factor, but to their minds, it might have been like more of the writing on the wall than the reason. The reason was calendrical timing, transformation and renewal. A new Bakhtun is started. An interesting thing that the Maya said at the dawn of the 12th Bakhtun was that by then the Spanish were there, and the Maya, the Itza Maya from the same area we're talking about, sent an entourage to Merida and told the Spanish, they said, a great cycle has ended and we are prepared for our change.
Mm,
And the weird thing is that people really, I think I might be one of the only people that did the math on it, that the year that they showed up and said that was the year that the 12th Bakhtun started.
I have so many questions there. I know so little about the Maya and their calendar. I think though the distinction you're trying to make, and I think it's an important one to emphasize here, because is there are other explanations for the abandonment of places besides environmental determinism, and archaeologists especially are sensitive to just the environmental deterministic explanation because the way people respond, cultures and individuals and religions to environmental factors varies so much. It's not like a one-to-one, it's not a correlation all the time. And like you're trying to emphasize, there's a lot of religious reasons that may coincide with an environmental reason, but you're saying you're calling it the writing on the wall is might be the signals might be coming from not necessarily a purely economic worldview. So that is
And they would
important.
make a decision like in this case, in this particular case. And I'm not saying that environmental determinism isn't a factor. I'm saying that humans are complicated,
Right, right.
especially humans that don't come from our Western perspective. They can be kind of inscrutable in what their decision making process was. So, in the case of El Mirador, do we feel comfortable saying that the people that built that incredible city ran into a roadblock of agricultural productivity and said, let's bag it. I guess we screwed this one up. No, I mean they could have. I mean they were brilliant people. They could have come up with another strategy and saved the city, but they chose to leave it. And I think that choosing to leave it is more than just a practical decision about it's become a pain in the ass to farm here. I think it had more to do with their worldview and the cyclical nature of things.
Now that brings up, I think this would be a place I would look to try to understand the differences of like El Mirador. Maybe you can help me here. So are there any big Maya settlements that were continuously occupied from the pre-classic up into the contact with Spanish and even today?
There are a handful. There are a handful. One of the most famous is Dizi Bil Chaltun, right just north of modern day Merida. That was a pre-classic city, never missed a beat, went right through the classic, right through the post-classic, and it was still a vibrant Maya city when the Spanish arrived, to the point that the Spanish built a church in the middle of their plaza to try to actively convert them there. So there was that one. The other one that I can think of right off the bat is Laminai. Laminai is in Belize, and it's on the shore of a big lake, so it didn't have any of the water problems, but it
That's what I'm
it
trying to get
again
at.
never missed a beat. We can track its progress from pre-classic right up to Spanish contact, where the Spanish again built a big church there, but when the church became unstable and they were doing restoration work, they realized the Maya had put Maya offerings at the four corners of each corner of the church had Maya offerings at the base. So they slipped in a little Maya religion into the religious structure they were building for the Spanish. So there are two examples, but perhaps you're asking because of their environmental or their geographic position.
That's what I'm getting at. And I'm interested in maybe the soils now. I think there's a combo. If we have hydrology and soil issues, we have issues. And then maybe the soils are related to um, terrain that has to be, if it's sloped versus flat or something where soils could easily be eroded versus not. I'm just wondering if those
Well,
two
let's
sites,
let's
good
think about
watering
that for
soil.
these two cities. Zibi Chaltun is up in the Yucatan, not anywhere near rivers, but it has a number of cenotes on the site. So even though the water table probably dropped and rose over time, they almost always had a water source within the city. But the soil capacity there is terrible. It's a very iron, like red soil and very rocky. It's hard to farm there. Today, I mean, people spend a lot of time just culling rocks out of their property just to try to farm.
Hmm.
So there's that one, at least what I know about it. I'm sure There are probably very cool geology reports that you would find fascinating and I would find over my head about that environment. But Lamanai is right on a lake. And actually, it's not even way higher than the lake. It's there's a rise from the lake to the average elevation of the city, but it's right on a lake. So they've got plenty of water and they have plenty of fertile soil there. So, I mean, maybe that was one of the reasons they survived, but I can think just as I'm talking, there's an almost identical situation that ended up kind of disastrous, which was the classic city of Yaxha in Guatemala. They are right on a big lake too. In fact, there's a segment of the ruins that is on an island in the middle of that lake.
Cool.
But I've read that paleoclimate studies and cores along the lake clearly show that they cut down all the trees around the lake, and that the lake, as a consequence, silted in terribly. And the people that study Yasha are fairly emphatic that they believe that it was this destruction of their local environment that ruined their ability to harness the local resources to feed their huge population, and the city was abandoned. So we have, you know, almost an identical topography to Laminai, which is really just right across the Belize border. It's not too far from where Yasha sat, but one failed and one continued.
Hmm. And I think that the one you're talking about that's silted in, is that Lake P10 or Pay10?
No, that's a much bigger lake to the west of there. This is I think it's called Yasha, Lake Yasha, after the ruins. But it's a big, from big, huge Lake Peten, Itza, in the middle of the Peten,
Hmm.
there's this chain of lakes that goes towards the Belize border. And there were all sorts of cool little Maya communities there, even at contact. And Lake Yasha is one of those lakes, but a bigger one, where a whole city was sitting next to it and did great for, heck, I think Yasha lived 600 years. I
Hmm.
always like to remind students, like, you know, America's been at it 200 years and we seem to be floundering right now. So, they be impressed by 600 years of success.
Yeah, that's a long time. They had a good run. I think I know the silting into the lakes is so common. They call them the Maya clay layers. Are you aware of
Hey,
this in the
not that
lakes?
term specifically, but I'm not surprised. I think that there was lots of evidence of, human environmental destruction that then led to disastrous consequences for the places they called home.
That's why I think it's a combination of both the soil and the hydrology because of that clay layer that's found in down there. But yeah, it's weird that you're saying then there's two lakes. One lake has like an iron oxide rich soil. It doesn't. It persists through the.
No, no, no. That was Dizzybull Taltoon up in the Yucatan. That's the one where the soils are all red. The soils at these two lakes are like dark brown.
I think those would be more like, and I'm starting to think, maybe calcareous soils, because I think those lakes they're hard water, and the
Yeah.
lakes
Yep,
and
yep.
the soils have carbonate minerals in them, so we call them like a calcareous rich soil. Maybe, and then you have the limestone bedrock because that's the cenote, and that could explain why you don't see creeks in some of these areas because of those underwater caverns, essentially. In karstic terrain with limestone, you rarely see these streams you find with sandstone and shale, the
That's
dendritic.
exactly the case at Pitanitsa. Pitanitsa is a huge lake. Its lowest point is 220 meters. It's a big, deep lake, but there are no rivers coming in, and the hydrology says that they are underground rivers that are feeding the lake, not above ground ones. So you're right on the money there.
Yeah,
You
it's
know,
all on track.
in the vein of this discussion, let's talk about Tikal a little bit. Tikal is amazing and really, showcases the capacity of the Maya to get over these geologic challenges. I mean, when Tikal starts up, there are not many many Maya communities around Lake Pitenitsa. Plenty, a perennial water source. Maybe the rivers are underneath, but why wouldn't they have just built this big city on the lake shore? Instead, they go 80 kilometers to the north to a place that has no rivers whatsoever. It's kind of on a rise surrounded by lowlands, bajos, and those are the places that they're farming. But the rise itself, no water sources, and yet they built a city that rose to at least 80,000 people. And they did it by digging out these gigantic reservoirs and canting their plazas 1 degree so they would fill in these reservoirs, giant catchment basins as plazas. I mean, so sophisticated, so much huge labor, such a great understanding of hydrology to pull this off. Uh, when they have that kind of capacity, doesn't it seem kind of just doesn't hit your ears right to say, oh, there was a little bit of silting in of the lake and they just gave up the ghost. These people had infinite capacity to manage these things if they wanted. Tikal was one such. We've long thought, this is a perfect example of the Western mind versus the Maya mind. Like, that was stupid and inefficient. And, there were other resources. Why did they make this huge effort? It doesn't make any sense. But I think what they did is they controlled a water source. They created and controlled a water source and then steeped it in, religious iconography and festival and cult activity to bond a society around it. But it doesn't make sense from a Western point of view. Why didn't they just pick a less inhospitable place to build Tikal? And I don't think I have all the answers to that, but I think it's important to contemplate those. We in the Western world are all about efficiency. It's
Hmm.
efficiency. It's efficiency. When we see people doing it the hard way, we're like, well, are they stupid? But the Maya were clearly not stupid. I'll stop ranting here for a moment, but let me finish this by saying one of my colleagues that I admire the most, Bill Fash, who's Bowditch chair at Harvard right now. He one time said something that was so succinct and so profound to me that I've never forgotten it. He didn't say it to me; he said it on a documentary. um, but he said, when you're making things for the gods, it's not supposed to be easy. That was a profound statement. I mean, I think we in the Western world look at these cities and we get caught up in our own ideals of efficiency, and we don't count that sort of like, maybe they did it the hard way on purpose kind of mentality.
Hmm. Hmm. I mean, when you look at something like Machu Picchu, I know this is a whole different society, and it's a religious structure up in the middle of the mountains for the king to live at, or it was a retreat for a high up status people. Makes no sense to build Machu Picchu because it was a good site to grow corn.
No, no, it was a terrible challenge. I personally, my pet theory on that is the Inca Empire managed to get 10 million people to participate in their society, but it was all founded on mita labor, that everybody pays their taxes through basically corvée labor. And when they realized they had 10 million people that they had to employ or society fell apart, they started coming up with ridiculously ambitious projects like Machu Picchu.
Wow, I've
Like,
never heard
geez, I
that
mean,
one.
I got to figure out something that 10,000 people can do. Well,
Yeah,
how about making that mountain a palace?
yeah. We're just gonna hang out up there and do stuff. Like, okay,
Because really,
sounds
Inca
good.
society would fall apart if everybody wasn't able to do their job as their taxes. And they ended up becoming it's my pet theory that some of their most ambitious projects were really just like a huge WPA project.
Hmm. That's an interesting way to think about it and look at it. And I think, but overall, it's good to emphasize that these places that we view as important settlements, they don't just dissolve and are abandoned for simple economic reasons that us in the Western world look at. And when you talk about Tikal and its location away from the lake, even even though the lake's there with water and supposedly good for agriculture, my first thing I'm starting to, I think of is defense, security from other people. And so the water may have become a secondary security issue to we find a defensible location. I'm not saying I don't know that Tikal that location was more defensible than its other place, but security reasons could be another reason why you choose somewhere it's just a defensible location.
That's a very human universal that I think you're right on the money with that one. And in point of fact, I mean, we can kind of point to the things that were happening in the Tikal Crucible that sparked the Maya Wars. I mean, we see the Maya Wars in hieroglyphs and in archaeology, but the unknown question is how long were they brewing under the surface before it broke into a huge civil war? So you're right. Tikal's location might also have to do something with brewing disgruntlement among Maya cities.
Hmm. And so we got to consider those factors as well. And I mean, warfare, it seems to be a byproduct of bad environmental conditions sometimes, I think. I mean, I think if one settlement has a bad
Well, certainly,
harvest,
scarcity of resources makes
yeah,
people
that's what I'm
fight
getting.
over them. That's a commonality as well.
So you could have one site that was fine during this theoretical drought, growing, being fine, and they just get pillaged and burned down and sacked by the warfare neighbor that didn't have good soils, but were training like Spartans so they could come over there and whack them with the club really hard. And I mean, you must be an expert too, or know a lot more on Maya warfare because they were a very, at least the late classic, they're a warring society, right? Can you tell us
Oh,
about that?
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, they basically that is definitely one of the huge factors that led to the collapse of classic Maya society. I think people were sick of fighting each other and
Mm.
doing it upon the orders of this elite class in the cities. I think people walked away for a number of reasons, but I think that endemic warfare was definitely one of them. We don't see much in the way of at least Maya public art showing us warfare until the classic period really starts rolling. You can almost tie it to the arrival of Teotihuacan with their people dressed up as warriors with atlatls and armor. They show up to the Peten, not to Tikal first, but they land on Tikal really hard. We're actually just realizing, thanks to the work of Edwin Roman, that Tika Teotihuacan was there at least 100 years earlier than we thought. There's
Mm.
this classic entrada that happens at Tikal in 378 AD, where the monuments all say Teotihuacan arrived, and the Maya king of Tikal enters the water, which means he dies, and installed is a prince from Teotihuacan named Yashain. So a huge thing that happens, and right then the Maya start getting fighty, and they fight each other. Tikal dominates its neighbors, and then Calakmul to the north of them says, "No, we're not having any of that." And this huge civil war starts with either your team Tikal or your team Calakmul. And we see these alliances and enemies flip flopping over a couple of centuries until the whole thing falls apart. Warfare pretty much stops among the Maya at least decades before the actual collapse happens. So that's a weird factor too. Again, looking through our Western eyes, it's hard to understand the sense of it. Why were they fighting? Because, if these battles had gone on in Europe, once one city dominates another, they take that territory. It's about dominating the resources of that area. It's about planting your flag in that place. The Maya didn't do that, really. They did not take over big swaths of land. All of these independent city states were allowed to stay independent under the auspices of one of those two huge juggernauts, Calakmul or Tikal. But in the end, Tikal kind of wins the day. They do win the day. Calakmul falls, Tikal rises, and again in a Western scenario, you'd expect that the losers would be absorbed or blow, and the winners would stay where they are and grow. But it's weird that everybody abandons the cities, whether they were on the losing side or the winning side. By the time that 10th Bakhtun rolls around, they leave all these cities. If I think about time, not in our time, but in their time,
Mhm.
yes, it is interesting that within decades, a little before, a little after, I think the 10th Bakhtun is 830. Tikal is one of the last ones to give up the ghost. I think we have a monument from the 860s there. Palenque is one of the first to go. It's in 799. But in that time period, a couple decades around this 10th Bakhtun, hundreds of Maya cities are abandoned.
That's really interesting. I've never heard about this. And is this calendar demarcated by solar or lunar or celestial movements?
No, that's the weird thing.
What is this?
It's they have the Maya have a number of calendars. They do have a straight solar calendar. We call it the Hob, 365 days. They have lunar calendars. They have their most important calendar is the sacred calendar of 260 days. That was the first one they ever created, the one they're still holding on to today. The one I'm talking about is the long count. They're kind of linear count of days. And so it has days, months of 20 days, and then here's the weird part. Its year, called a tune, is 360 days, not 365, 360. So it's a full 5 days every year off the solar calendar. Then the next position up is 20-year periods called Katuns, and then there's 400-year periods called Bakhtuns. And all of the Maya monuments start with this long count. So that is the date they're choosing to tell you on literally hundreds, probably thousands of monuments that we have now that have a long count date that start their narrative. But it's 360 days, which is still not understood. We got a lot of theories out there, but no consensus, and it is weird.
Hmm. Now, could it just be a coincidence of this 10th Bakhtun and the rough abandonment of these sites? Or there's,
Absolutely, absolutely. It is my pet theory.
it's a pet
I
theory.
see I see big changes going on throughout the Maya world at the turn of these Bakhtuns. And if you talk to the Maya, we just went through another one of these turns of Bakhtuns. That's what 2012 was about. December 21st, 2012 was uh the arrival of the 13th Bakhtun. And the Maya calendar in the previous cycle reset at 13 Bakhtuns to, like the odometer in your car, it became zero. And so we were thinking that the Maya were predicting an end in 2012 based on the 13th Bakhtun arriving. But when I talked to modern Maya people about this, I did a funny little thing one time where I walked through a village in 2009 and just asked common people, hey, do you know what your birthday is in the Maya calendar? And they'd say, oh yeah, I'm 6 Semish. That's my name. And that's my birthday. And I said, do you know that people are saying that the Maya predicted the end of the world with their calendar? And everybody would say, no, that's not that wouldn't happen. A lot of them said, time's a cycle. It goes on forever. And and then sometimes I'd say, well, they're saying that because it's a major time of a cycle is coming to an end, a big 400-year cycle from your ancestors. And they said, look, when we come to the end of great cycles, it's our duty to renew the world and transform the way we behave. Those are our messages. It wouldn't be the end, it would be a time to transform and renew the world. The Aztec did a similar thing. They called it the new fire ceremony. For them, they didn't have the long count. Their biggest cycle was 52 years. And so at every 52 years, the Aztec would do the new fire ceremony where they'd burn down perfectly good temples and build up new ones. And they would sweep things out, they would change. Sometimes they'd totally change their political leaders and structures. So this notion in Mesoamerica that the ends of cycles are times of renewal and transformation that are going to happen to you no matter what, but you could be in the driver's seat if you're the agent of that change. Those are the theories that I'm putting forward here. The eighth Bakhtun is right about when the Olmec gave up. The ninth Bakhtun is the beginning of the classic period. The 10th Bakhtun is the end of the classic period. 400 years later, at the 11th Bakhtun, what happens? Chichen Itza's been running as as a city and controlling the Yucatan for 400 years. And when do they decide to give up? The Chalambalams say something like 1229, which is right at the 11th Bakhtun. And then the 12th Bakhtun, the Itza show up to Merida and say a great cycle has changed and we're prepared for our change. And then that brings us to the 13th Bakhtun, which was 2012. But I see every one of the Bakhtuns in recorded Maya history, their turn comes along with major societal and cultural changes.
Hmm. I
It's a
can imagine.
theory, I like it.
I like it too, and I can just imagine, some farmers are outside of the city and they're just thinking, the soil's going to hell. All the trees are cut down. We got to climb up there to cut these trees down. It's coming to the end of the cycle here. And so, looking at the Stella, I think it's telling us we need to get moving. And so let's just, and then, that's an agreed upon kind of belief. And then it, it coincides with the crap.
And in that light, when you are already of a mentality, if you're already of a mentality that great changes happen at the ends of our cycles, and then all of a sudden your crops aren't as
Yeah.
good, your city's fortunes are falling apart, there's some, fat king who's not worth his snot up there. All these things become writing on the wall, as I said, that
Yeah.
okay, these are the signs that mean that things are changing. Let's be the agents of our own change. That's a nice Maya thing. They believe that it's their duty, it's their obligation to be the agents of those change. That the changes are coming, and we can either steward it or we can be the victims of it.
Mm, yeah. That's really cool. I've
And
never,
again, I don't want to overstate this for the internet that I've solved the all the mysteries of the Maya. I haven't. These are just my pet theories that I'm interested in and crow about whenever I'm given a platform. But I do, they come from a place where a long time ago when I was a student, like in my 20s, when I did that Mahashna thing, again, I had a professor, Linda Sheely, who said something really that's always stuck with me. I was coming up with all these theories like we're doing today about what would happen. And she looked at me and she said, if you don't stop thinking like a Western person and start trying to think like a Maya, you will never understand these people. Their motivations are not the motivations that make sense to you from your Western perspective. They're the motivations that make sense to them from their Maya perspective. And you have got to separate the two, or you're going nowhere in this field.
mm, yeah. Gotta think like a Maya when you're studying.
And that's back then. That's Linda told me to think like a Maya. When I looked at that topography map, I asked a weird question: if I was a Maya, where would my favorite part of this whole property be? Oh, right there. And somehow it paid off.
That's pretty cool. Um, what was I gonna say? Thinking like a Maya when you brought that up, for whatever reason, it jogged my memory talking with Richard Hansen, and he brought up that at El Mirador, they were obsessed with making lime plaster. And I forgot about this. And the ruins of the pyramids, I believe, are definitely inside the houses. They created vast amounts of lime plaster, and you need to cook the limestone with the wood. And this, along with the farming, led to this widespread deforestation. But the value, he said some of these high status homes had so much lime. Yes, he said exactly that, like inches thick, that he's like, there's no practical reason why that was there. It was definitely it was thinking like a Mayan, what they wanted for that
Did he
house.
say his favorite term? Did he say conspicuous?
Yes, he said that. Yes. So there's an example of, man, this is almost like a hybrid economic, determinism, because it's still talking about wood and resources, but you wouldn't understand the importance. It's not just agriculture. It was also they're building their temples and their sacred spaces and their domestic spaces. They needed this lime, or they wanted it. They didn't need it. Actually the key. They wanted it, and they used it to such an extent that um they
Yeah,
overused their
I
resources.
know this is I mean, between that and the ever expanding of the forest for crops, they really did put themselves in a hole. Now, the Copan Valley, that's a really good example where they completely took every tree out of the valley. And there've been a lot of studies there that show they have, and that they were having to go to the next valley over and the next valley over just to get wood. But what they did in that moment is that rain did not fall in their valley. It needs to go over some trees to drop just like a degree and drop the rain. So through deforesting, they did a worse thing, which is, in their particular little environmental niche of their valley, they decreased the rain itself by taking the trees away. The trees, as rainstorms go over the rainforest, going into, above those trees, the trees cool the the clouds just like a degree or two, but enough to trigger the release. And when there's no trees, it just passed right over the Copan Valley again and again. And they literally changed the weather
Mhm,
on this environmental degradation. Now, I
mhm.
have an interesting thing about limestone, but let me give you a chance to respond to that.
Right. Richard brought that up as well. That's something that's another factor at play at these areas, especially when we're talking about vast amounts of trees being lost. It does affect even the local climate. So that I'm glad you brought that up to remind me about that. So tell me about your
And when you do El Mirador and Copan, it's kind of sadly like the Maya didn't learn their lesson. Those two are about, well, they're 1,000 years apart. I'm sure, lessons are found and lost 1,000 times in that time. But what I was going to say is a really interesting study where, you know, I'm enamored with asking the modern Maya about a lot of these questions. I think they've been not part of the conversation enough as they should be. And every time somebody honestly asks them about it, the results are so interesting. And so in terms of this, like, you're right, limestone takes a hot fire to burn. You've basically got to take limestone and burn it so hard it turns into dust. And then that dust becomes something different. It's I think the term is activated lime. Once you get it burned down with this intense fire down to this dust, then when you pour water into it, it does this exothermic reaction and it turns into stucco. I've played around, I've done it myself in Chiapas with the help of some Maya friends. So I understand the process. But what I was getting to is a little study that happened at Tikal. At Tikal, we've actually found a set of 3 of these kilns where they were burning down the limestone. And so I forget who did it, but somebody wanted to do a replication study and asked the Maya workers of Tikal to make limestone in these kilns because they were using it for restoration stuff, right? So how would you guys do it? How would you guys use these kilns and burn limestone? And they assumed they were going to use some good hardwoods that burned hot and long. But that was not the choice the Maya made. The Maya instead used very small green trees. They were like greenwood, they called them. They said greenwood is this, live wood, not burnt, not dried out. But when you use this greenwood, it burns just as hot as the hardwoods. And so it threw a whole monkey wrench into this whole concept that limestone stucco production had to use only the big trees. When the Maya of Tikal, modern Maya, were asked to do it, they used little twig trees that could grow up and, be back in a year.
Yeah.
And that's how they made the stucco for the modern archaeologists. And it was a surprise to all the Western guys like me, but probably, every Maya around Lake Pictinitza was like, duh, that's how you do it.
I wonder how, if you're in the Maya period, how you would process. Let's say you had a giant mahogany tree. You've an obsidian axe and a stone axe. It would take a lot of work to cut it down, to get it into bits and pieces to burn, and that it would just been easier to get bushes.
And if you knew that was the kind of resource you needed for this, you could make a whole crop of just, this greenwood little things. They were little stems that they could cut down. I mean, they were small tree trunks that were green wood, but it burns just as hot as the hardwood. Here's another funny one about limestone too. Another factor that I don't think we talk about often enough is how much burned limestone you need to consume corn. The process of
Nickel.
nixtamalization, they call it. The nutrients in corn
Yeah.
are not very good unless you boil them in this activated lime paste, and that pulls out all the nutrients out of corn and makes it much more nutritious. Every Maya today is doing that. I had an ignorant time, maybe a decade ago or so. I was strolling through the market in uh, Chichicastenango in the highlands of Guatemala. It was market day. There was tons of stuff. I'm just walking around like a tourist, and I come upon this guy with a big table full of nothing but burned rocks, burned limestone. And I walk up like a jerk and say, "I got to ask you, who is buying your burned rocks, man?" And he said, "You're a fool. Everyone's buying my burned rocks. You need this in order to soak your corn so it has nutrition. Every person in this market needs my burned rocks, and you're a fool." And I thought, like, well, holy shit, I am a fool. And then it made me think, like, gosh, if every pot of Maya corn needs burned limestone in order to activate it, there's a whole nother source of need for this. Not just stucco, but actually food consumption. Is those burned rocks are vital for it.
That is, again, a fascinating connection. So there's
And what a Western mind. I walked up to this guy's table and scoffed at him with his burned rocks. Totally schooled me. Burned rocks are hell of a important to Maya.
Yeah, wow. I burn rocks like those limestone in our lab, so I'm familiar with it. And you have to get limestone to, I mean, we burn it to 950 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's hot enough when you should never do this, but if you've cracked and looked in the muffle furnace at that temperature, it's glowing orange like the sun. That's what it looks like. And organic matter, just as reference point, regular wood, organic matter is long gone by 450 to 500.
451, right?
Yeah.
Fahrenheit 451.
Is it 451?
Combustion point. Yeah, I think some guy named Kurt Vonnegut wrote a book with that title.
Oh, yeah. That's why. Okay. So nice. Yeah. But so that just shows how hot you have to get it, that even wood is way down there to get it up to that temperature. Maybe they were using those woody plants to make charcoal with like clay. You know how they like pile wood and then you cover it with soil and burn it slowly, make charcoal. I think you need to get charcoal to get it that hot, but maybe with the green wood with the water. But that I feel like the
And
water,
insulating it with things on top of it. I don't know,
yeah,
but the Maya did it.
they
There's,
certainly did it. So they
the
had to have
the
figured out
stucco on temples 1 and 2 is made through that.
you have to get it really, really, really hot. And when we're out in the islands too, talking about these smaller trees, we have this wood called halicoa, and it's they brought it in because they cut down the native vegetation. This is like a nitrogen fixing tree. They sprayed it on fields. Now it's invasive, but it's actually pretty hard wood, and it grows as thick as your shoulder or leg. And out on the islands, the remote islands where bags of charcoal are hard to come by, there aren't Walmarts. Everybody uses pucks of these halicoa branches. They're just cut into pucks and they bag them up and take them to the beach. And you'll see piles of these like little pucks of halicoa wood, and they're perfect for barbecues on the beach. And I was like, that's awesome because they're invasive and you'd never have to run out. And it turns out it's a great wood to cook with.
Oh yeah, the on Easter Island it's eucalyptus,
Okay.
which is not as good as that stuff probably, but the people are using it all over the place. It's funny how the island that you're sitting on, and I think Easter Island to a much worse degree, but all of them, they're kind of environmental Frankensteins. I
Today,
mean,
yeah.
like we disnuded a lot of it, and then we replaced it with all sorts of trees from around the world, and boats have brought all sorts of invasive species. And today, know, Hawaii is literally a Frankenstein from an environmental sense.
Yeah, the low elevations especially, you can see some of the koa wood. Some of the native forests are found really high up in elevation, but yeah, everything down where anybody is living, just all the grasses are brought in. I'm actually working with a PhD student I'm not working with him. I'm aware of his work that we're using, that he's in botany, and he went through the ship import logs from the Hawaiian monarchy and found out when and how much grass seed they brought in and when they brought it in and the types of grasses they brought in. And because they brought a lot of African grasses, a lot of tropical Asian grasses here when they wanted to raise cattle, and then the native grasses here were no good.
Right.
But when you see the ship logs, he just says like these dates and like when these various plants were brought in, the monarchy was very concerned with knowing what is brought into port. So they have good records for taxation purposes. And
You
then
mean the Hawaiian royalty before they were totally overthrown?
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. The monarchy before they were overthrown, the queen was overthrown, and then we were annexed in. She was arrested in her palace close by here. But anyway, I don't want to get down into that. The whole thing is, yeah, that was during that time. They brought in all these plants. It's remarkable when you see the introduction of the seeds, the changes in the fire regimes follow right behind. And it turns out grasses are fire prone. They depend on fire. They're not maintained with cows and agriculture and plowing. They overgrow fields alongside roads, and they cause huge change. They just overall changed the fire regimes on the islands. Hawaii had very rare fires are rare on these islands compared to today. Even though they're volcanic, it seems like prior to Polynesians, very rarely did they experience fire. The plants are not very fire adapted. So they're very sensitive to outbreaks. And when we do burn the endemic vegetation in the Hawaiian Islands, what happens is it allows the invasion of grasses to come in. They'll actually seed faster, grow quicker than anything we find here that is from here. I want to switch gears. I think it's so good that you're emphasizing. I'm a geologist, a paleoclimatologist, and I have worked at Cahokia, and I have produced a paper that was very environmentally deterministic, even though I didn't want to.
I read that paper.
Yeah, and I did, and I want to get into that a little bit later, and I did kind of get to that conclusion dragging my feet after a few years, the drought at Cahokia. But I want to talk about Poverty Point because it's such a strange anomaly. Talk about a place where there is no economic, from our Western worldview, economic reason for it to exist. And similarly, its abandonment is also a mystery as far as I'm aware. And it's, yeah, everything about Poverty Point in Louisiana. I know you've done some videos on it. Tell us about Poverty Point and why is it such a strange site?
Well, the first amazing thing about Poverty Point is, of course, its age. I
Mhm.
mean, the city was the first evidence of it, I'd say, is 1800, 1700. But by 1500, they've built a gigantic pyramid.
This is
We
BC,
call it a mound. What?
1500 BC.
Yeah, 1500 BC. Thank you for that clarification. So really before intensive agriculture is anywhere in the America or in North America. And yet the population of the city seems over 5,000 people. So a huge gathering, at least in terms of residential capacity. It has these giant berms that are in kind of the shape of like a Greek amphitheater. There are 6 of these berms and they have houses on top of them, and those berms bracket a big plaza that's up against the bayou where boats could come in and out. Really a sophisticated urban environment at a ridiculously early age for sitting in the middle of the bayous of Louisiana, no less. So incredible place, but no agriculture and no pottery.
There's
So that was a weird thing too. Now, how they fed people there was probably just the riverine resources. They were great at harvesting, fish and shellfish out of the bayous there. That in a number of parts of the world has been shown to be a viable way to feed a large population. The Olmec city of San Lorenzo was much the same. It had that kind of riverine environment, and they just became masters of it to feed their people. But what exactly is Poverty Point? I am not completely convinced by the evidence that it is an urban center where 5,000 people lived all year long. I think there's a possibility that it could be instead a central gathering point for a more dispersed population that came in to do like civilization wide annual festivals and events. I think it was kind of could be a pilgrimage spot where a base population lived there all along with priests and administrators, but that its population would surge when the local region would gather there for civilization wide events. That's not an uncommon pattern in human history. There are lots of examples around the world where a dispersed population that share a culture then get together on a semi-annual basis a couple of times a year to kind of not just reaffirm their cohesiveness as a civilization, but also do more practical things like find a wife or
social.
talk about region-wide security against those people out there.
Mm. I think that's the thinking today is along those lines. It's more of a get together point because it is hunter gatherer. Even though we associate hunter gatherers with mobility, they certainly found this place to be special enough to invest the time to create some infrastructure there because the central mound, it's tall. I don't know if it's by area very big. I climbed it, but it is a tall one. It's maybe as tall or taller than Monk's Mound.
It's not quite as tall as Monk's
It's
Mound.
not
I
as tall.
think in its current state, I think it's at about 70 feet high,
Mhm.
and Monk's Mound is just over 100.
Okay.
But it certainly was the biggest thing
It's the
in North
biggest.
America until Monk's Mound was built.
Okay. And I was gonna say it's the biggest thing around Poverty Point because Poverty Point is right along tributaries of the Mississippi River all kinds of lakes and wetlands all around it, and it is flat. It is flat as you can imagine. So if you're on that 70-foot tall mountain, you could really see a lot, and I could see it being a special place back in that time. But then it brings up the question, you know, contrasting with Cahokia. Cahokia is an extremely socially hierarchical, agriculturally intensive society that organized to construct Monk's Mound at 100 feet today or something around there. All of a sudden, Poverty Point, Louisiana, and these bayous and the swamps and the backwaters of that we call the backwaters today, they came together 3,000 years ago to put this huge mound of earth together to do rituals with very little social hierarchy, as far as I'm aware, like at least in the cultural material record.
Yep, that's absolutely true. We do
So it's
not
just so
find
weird.
like a diversification of residential units or any kind of like exotic goods that are limited to certain parts of the site. It seems very egalitarian in the distribution of artifacts and the size of what we at least think we've identified as residences. One of the really just mind bending things about it is that we've been digging there for decades and decades. We have not found any skeletons. The graves were either they were either cremating and we just haven't identified them as such, but no skeletons. We lack that data. We don't have a single resident of Poverty Point to analyze, which is, frustrating. That's a whole dimension that a place like Cahokia can give us in abundance, and Poverty Point, that dimension of analysis we're robbed of. So it makes it yet one more part of the mystery. Now, I almost said the word enigma, which I hate enigmas in archaeology. I feel like they're like really signposts telling us we're looking at something wrong. We cling to our patterns, but if we can't find any patterns, hell, we may be totally misunderstanding what we're looking at. But in the case of Poverty Point, there is an entire Poverty Point, if I could use the term civilization, a culture that people get really sensitive about, civilization's
Yeah,
only
yeah.
for white guys or something. But, we found contemporary, not as big as Poverty Point, but it's called, Poverty Point culture. And there's this artifact group called Poverty Point objects that are also found in those satellite sites. And they go into the Yazoo River Basin in Mississippi, and they go all the way down to the Gulf. So there was, you know, Poverty Point is not an enigma. It is the largest city of a very region wide cultural pattern that was happening.
And without any burials there, it makes me picture it. It makes me think that Poverty Point, could it be analogous to a fairgrounds for in our culture, where you show up?
That's the sort of thing we say about Chaco Canyon that has a dearth of burials. That's one of the points in favor of calling it a gathering area rather than an urban center.
And like the central show was something that happened on the mound that they all waited for once a year, and it was the big event, and you saw something happen up there
Yeah,
where
maybe astronomical, maybe it had something to do with, what it didn't have to do with? The agricultural cycle.
exactly, that's where I wanted to talk about this, because it just so many, why they did things there, the motivations are part of the culture that we just are doing our best to glean from.
There are hints that they were astronomers. Farmers, no. Astronomers, yes. You've got, Mound A, which is the big pyramid. If you go, there are two other mounds within the city's bounds that are directly north and directly south of uh of Mound A. They're like 600 meters off, so it's not that easy. They could have, that took some surveying. And to get a north-south line back then, they don't have the concept of a compass, so they had to do it astronomically. They had to they that kind of survey, a north-south line, had to be astronomical. There's another one called the Jackson Mound that's like a kilometer and a half away from Mound A, that's also perfectly on that north-south line, but it's built 1,000 years earlier. It's built at like 2500
Mm.
BC. And so there is a surveyed north-south line, unless it's the hugest coincidence we've ever found, which begs survey skills and, by proxy, astronomy skills. We've also found a number of those things called wood henges around Poverty Point. We haven't connected them to astronomy like the ones in Cahokia, but they sure do seem like the same tool. So those are two good reasons that we believe that astronomy was part of what was happening there.
Now, you mentioned earlier at Poverty Point, there's no ceramics, but they don't have ceramic bowls or
But they have
utilitarian.
stone bowls. They have stone bowls.
Yeah, they have stone bowls, but they do have ceramics there. They make these little figurines and these
Right, right.
decorative balls, but there are no pots or utilitarian. I'm calling it utilitarian pottery.
I think the distinction is that the all the objects at Poverty Point are sun baked. They are clay, but they are not baked in a kiln.
Really?
They are baked at a much lower. They are sun baked. They're like sun bricks. They're baked at a much lower temperature to make them. Now there's the ones that are the Poverty Point cooking balls,
Yeah, those.
and those probably got harder and harder over time, but those were basically, a fire would be under something, a basket or something they were cooking with, and then the those Poverty Point balls would be put in the fire, heated up, and then thrown into the water to boil the water and boil the fish or shellfish or whatever. But I could be wrong about this point, but I don't think so. I think that the distinction is that those are sun-baked clay objects. They are not burned in a kiln.
Okay. I wasn't aware. I know that they find them, they had dug something for like the visitor center, had a pile of dirt out front, and one of the clay figurines they make these human figurines. They found one
Tons of them.
eroding
There are
out of.
tons of them.
Yeah, tons of them. They found it eroding out of the soil hill. And to me, I feel like if it's just in the sun baked clay, wouldn't have that just dissolved or broken apart?
I think it depends on the quality of the clay and also the concept of temper. If it was just clay, then yeah, it would fall apart. But when you bind it together with temper, I think even sun-baked stuff can hold up a long time.
Mm, okay.
Same concept with sun-baked bricks. They're not just mud. You gotta put straw in them, or you gotta put, sand or ground up bone or things like that. But the things that Poverty Point making are a step below what we classify as ceramic. Now, what's interesting is, that same time period, especially where they're getting the kind of stone material that they're making bowls out of, and the idea to make bowls, that's coming from Georgia. And in Georgia at that time, they're inventing pottery. The earliest pottery, except for some examples in the Amazon for the whole Americas, is there in Georgia. It's that Stallings type pottery that was found along the Savannah River. And so it's weird that, even though Poverty Point was clearly trading with Georgia and getting the idea for their stone bowls from them, Georgia was holding out on them. Georgia had invented pottery and weren't sharing it with them.
That's weird. I didn't know about the origin of pottery in Georgia. And
Look it
that's
up. It's crazy. And I wish we would do a lot more work in Georgia. Georgia's got some intensely old stuff, and it's definite. The pottery there that's found in Georgia is older than anything in Mesoamerica, anything in the the Andean region. The only stuff that's older is that crazy, like 9,000-year-old stuff that Anna Roosevelt found in the Amazon.
Hmm. Whoa.
By the way, I was thinking about this internal dialogue in the back of my head. I think one of the rangers at Poverty Point in an email to me like a couple months ago, said they found a skeleton.
Really?
And so we might just have the excitement of seeing a publication here one of these days talking about the first ever skeleton found at Poverty Point.
Was that Diana Greenlee?
No, she's the big fish. This is a new ranger that actually got a job because he watched my videos and was a nice guy. He emailed me and said thanks for inspiring me. I'm now here and I'm working on astronomy stuff. He was at the time he was working on he thinks he found a lunar alignment there and he was trying to record it and bouncing ideas off of me. But in that same thread, I think he said they found a skeleton.
Wow, that's cool.
He helped find a mound that was not on the maps. That was kind of it got flattened out to the point where we had missed it, but LIDAR pulled it out. And I think they found a skeleton there, and it's part of his ideas about lunar
Yeah.
alignments.
The lunar thing has been a theme. Brad Lepper, he's an archaeologist in Ohio. He finds the connection at the Newark Earthworks and the Octagon
Oh yeah.
there. And I think Cahokia, there's some evidence for some lunar alignments or it,
Hey, Cahokia has the wood henge, which is
yeah.
so many poles. I get nervous as an archaeoastronomer. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. There's so many poles. We can line up two of them to do almost anything. Not to say that it's not astronomical in base. I'm saying like the stuff that actually Horn and Hively found that Brad Lepper believes in Newark is such a tighter argument.
Yeah, that's a remarkable story. He told me about that, and they were trying to disprove connections. Then they found that connection with the moon, and they were like, "Wow!" And it's an 18.6 year. Brad was out there during the peak of one, and it matches right up with the circle, the observatory through to the octagon, out the other way. And that's pretty remarkable because you always hear when you talk about these alignments and you see the conspiratory YouTube videos, like you can make a line from here to here and make it point to anything and say anything. But when you have that many coincidences and connections with that octagon thing with the doorways,
Newark is tight. And Brad,
right?
he is a hero because he used that kind of information and other things to really showcase the Hopewell civilization and wrenched that octagon away from a country club who had it covered in a golf course
So yeah.
for decades. Now it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the country club had to give up Newark's octagon because of Brad Lepper's relentless work.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that. I know he's huge and getting it preserved. I know he said the golf club is closed. When I talked to him, I wasn't aware that they had purchased it and made or the
I do believe
institution.
they did, and the state brokered the deal that was allowed. I think it's the Ohio Historical Connection who now manages it on behalf of the state. I think the state owns it.
So Poverty Point, it is an anomaly in a way because all these Western, the farm idea, the agriculture, why they built this, was it really a city? Or was it like more like a fairgrounds? It was before ceramics, but they had like proto clay figurine type things. And they find them everywhere, like these clay figurines and the balls. And it's like their
And there
number
are
one thing.
also there are totems carved out of precious stone that's nowhere near there. They had to import that. You've got those weird things that look like they
Plummet.
call them plummets.
Yeah.
Those are interesting, and we debate on what their function was.
Hmm.
Eileen fishing net, but who knows?
I actually was coring behind the big mound at the swamp. And I was with a student. He found a plummet sitting on the surface right by the lake behind the big mound.
How cool.
He's like, "Hey, check this out." And I walk over, sitting right on the surface, right by the lake. Beautiful gray plummet. It looks machine. And it's just, they're so beautiful. Look so precise. And we let Diana know right away. I was like, "Don't touch it. Keep the context." let's report it. Diana came out with the GPS, took a survey, and she was like, oh, this is a pretty nice one. We find these all the time, though.
You're right, though. I think that there's not enough admiration for how perfectly shaped those plummets are. There are thousands of them, and they're carved down. It would have taken a good amount of effort to create them, and they're so uniform.
They're so
They're
unique.
all about the same size. They all look like that teardrop, and
Mhm.
they're of a weird material too, aren't they? I forget.
It's not locally derived. It's a rock they had to have brought in from somewhere else because it's no bedrock is exposed at Poverty Point. I don't even think they have any rocks. That's one
I
issue.
want to say it's some kind of weakly magnetic stone.
It may be something like that, an iron rich kind of stone. It's a very
But
hard
it's not
mineralogy.
from there. It's amazing the amount. And you know what? Another weird thing beyond outside of Poverty Point culture area, you don't really find those Poverty Point objects outside of them. They're, at least archaeology is giving us the perspective that their trade relationship was very one way, that they got all sorts of things from outside Poverty Point's area, but there aren't a lot of Poverty Point objects that distribute outside of their area. So they're not trading like those plummets are very discreetly found. They are not all over the Americas. They are in the Poverty Point area, and that's it. The same thing with the Poverty Point balls. The They are obviously trading outside, but they're only getting things into the city. We don't see the evidence of them trading their wares outside to other cultures.
Hmm. This is an important distinction Brad Lepper made with me. And I think this is a good time to bring it up because in the theme of thinking like a Westerner, when we talk about the Hopewell Exchange Network, we talk about it, I think about it as an economic trade network. He's like, no, 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 you don't understand. People brought stuff to Newark to offer it to Newark, the person or the place. Things didn't leave Newark. Things went to Newark. And so when you brought obsidian, you paddled it all the way from Missouri and had it and you brought it there. It made the site more sacred. It was part of your pilgrimage. It was part of your religious incentive. I think we're seeing the same thing at Poverty Point where things are being brought to Poverty Point. Things don't get exported from Poverty Point.
Well said. And that is a point in favor of the pilgrimage festival ground hypothesis, isn't it?
Yeah, that's consistent
The
with
fact that their trade appears to be very one way would support exactly what you and Brad are saying.
and as a Westerner, you're always thinking, well, we want to make money, so you'd import this and you want to have it go out and you want to, you know, it's got to be some sort of like calories are being exchanged, but no, it's not. It's not like that. I mean, in a way, maybe Mecca type offering, you come into Mecca and you give your charity or something, it would be more equivalent for these sites. They're more like religious fairgrounds.
Gosh, and ancient history is replete with patterns like that. The Americas, but beyond the Americas as well. You know, the concept of a pilgrimage site where people come in and give either symbolic or actual economic offerings. It's been going on forever. It's a very strong human pattern.
There's so much I want to talk to you about. We're almost at 2 hours. I want to keep talking. I have a couple things I want to get to with you.
Yeah, I will have to get on with my day here eventually. So let's
Yeah.
let's turn a corner here.
Yeah. Okay. Um, so Cahokia I'm working on that site there, and I wrote the paper with scientific reports, and it shows that there's a shift to dryness at the end of the Mississippian occupation of Cahokia. But we started looking more at the data a little closer and looking at the Palisade Wall dates, and they've done some more radiocarbon, what is it called? Some distribution modeling. So you can actually determine the beginning of the construction of the Palisade Wall around Cahokia and its end of the construction. It's very strange. I have a new paper where I'm comparing all this data very, very closely. And what we're finding, and it's actually in review, at Nature Communications right now is there's this distinct layer, disturbance layer deposited similar to the Maya clay layer at the Stirling phase of Cahokia, which is like the big expansionary phase. But it turns out the Palisade Wall wasn't built during the Stirling phase. It wasn't built during the apex.
Right. It was built after 1100 and a couple of times towards its like rebuilt 3 times before the city's abandonment, right?
Exactly. So it was built after the apex of Cahokia a few times. Now, this is the interesting thing is the disturbance layer that indicates environmental changes happens during the Stirling phase. And then the wall is built following the environmental disturbance suggested by the core. So it seems as though the wall, which the debate was, did the wall, the construction of the wall, cause the environmental change? That was the old hypothesis from Lake Lapinot. That
Like a deforestation hypothesis.
exactly that the building of the wall, the building of the city actually caused this environmental degradation. But it turns out that the environmental degradation preceded the wall. So that's one of the major findings that we have in this upcoming paper is that happened. And so the wall was a response to the environmental change. I think it wasn't the cause of the environmental change. And also the wall corresponds with increasing dryness detected in the paleoclimate record. So we have stresses climate wise, and then we have the wall being built. So it seems as though that wall is a response to both maybe environmental degradation and climate. It seems to be just a response culturally, like you're saying, to the behavior of the environment. But overall, that wall construction doesn't seem to lead to collapse. It gets rebuilt several times, and then eventually people leave the site.
So what you're saying, or let me understand what you're suggesting. I think what you're suggesting is the evidence you found of environmental degradation is related, or that caused a scarcity of resources for a city on the rise, and that the wall was a response to sudden scarcity of resources and concerns about infighting to get them.
I think that's it. Yeah.
Very interesting, because I think it's a unanswered question at the moment in the literature about what exactly triggered Cahokia to build these walls. Were they worried about foreigners? Were they worried about internal revolution? I guess your hypothesis is leaning towards internal revolution, that they had built up a certain agricultural resource base that then got suddenly cut off at the knees by environmental disaster. And the result was an angry local population that wasn't getting what they were promised. And the wall had to come up to defend them from their own people.
I think you said it better than I could have. I think that's it. And the wall is a response. It isn't the cause of the change. And yeah, you pretty
Now,
much
I'd
nailed
love to see you take this research and run with it to some of the other cities that also developed walls.
it. Yeah, there's others. Almost all the Mississippian sites, the prominent ones, have walls.
Almost all of them.
Yeah,
And
Kincaid.
so,
We've worked a little bit there in Moundville, but I think it was.
you've got Plum Bayou, right? That's
Mhm.
before that, and definitely was a population that was part of Cahokia's surge. But Plum Bayou doesn't have a palisade, right? It's got kind of berms a la Hopewell stuff around 3 sides and then the bayou, but it doesn't have a palisade. There's one called Holly Bluff. Do you know Holly Bluff?
Mm-mm.
Uh, it's along a river too, and it has that 3 sides, and it's before Cahokia, but I can't remember whether it has a palisade or whether that was just some farcical reconstruction drawing I saw. But I love what you've come up with here, and it'd be thrilling to see if you could come up with that pattern happening again at another site, because then you'd really have you know,
Yeah, that's a good.
a pattern to discuss.
We see the environmental, we call it the disturbance layer at Kincaid, but I don't know if we have the walls on the Palisade as clearly demarcated there. But that is an interesting suggestion. That's a good thing to look into a little bit more. And I
Who
was
made the
really
first
hesitant.
walls and why?
Yeah, I was hesitant to go along the environmental deterministic route because I was aware. And Cahokia, it doesn't make sense really even. And I did the study because that area of the Midwest is not prone to droughts. It's actually, water exceeds
Yeah,
evaporation almost all
it's
year.
prone to floods.
Yeah, it's prone to floods, especially in the cold season when there's no evaporation. And it's next to the Mississippi River. It's next to Horseshoe Lake, and the Mississippi River certainly didn't dry up. But we see the clay layer in there, so I think we have the example of hydrology mixed with soil degradation and deforestation, and you combine all those factors, and you have a dust bowl type scenario when there's just a little bit of dryness. And we know maize, it is a very strange crop because it's sensitive to drought only when it's setting its tassels and creating the seeds. So it can grow as a plant and look fine to a person, but it won't set kernels unless it gets moisture during the cob pollination.
Mm.
So if you get a dry spell during this like 3 to 4 week window in the Midwest, it's June and July, there will be no kernels on your corn cob. Essentially will happen. And your plants will look fine, but you'll just have a bunch of empty cobs. And so there
That would be
is a
disappointing.
sensitivity. If you're dependent on maize, your society is just by definition going to be sensitive to climate because of that connection in these seasonal climates, especially when you have a short growing season, like near St. Louis and not in a tropical.
So I read the paper, and some of the time frames in the paper and what we're discussing don't exactly add up to me. So let me ask some questions without being adversarial. I'm not trying to like bust your argument or nothing. I just want to understand. You had just said that right when the kind of big pickup and development of Cahokia, but before the walls. So we're talking 1050, right?
Yes, 1050 to
You
1200.
see you see some environmental degradation there.
Mm-hmm.
That I don't think I got out of that paper. Maybe I'm a bad reader. But the paper seemed to say that the real beginnings of this environmental degradation were right around 1200. Is that did I get that right?
So there's two papers. The one that talks about the environmental degradation is cited in that paper I sent you, but that's a previous paper. The disturbance layer is dated to 1150 to 1220. So that's the clay layer in the lake core is dated.
50 to 1220. Okay, well that's tighter. That's like right when they're to my reading understanding, that's when that's when things really started to fall apart. Like right about 1150 is when population is visibly declining.
I
But then
think,
there was one last part of your paper that maybe I misunderstood, but it said that 1350 to 1450 was the worst of these droughts,
yeah.
and that Cahokia totally fell then. But Cahokia was done by then. I mean, it
Mhm.
was overgrown for a century at that point.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of a debate on the timings of those in the time series that we show, we give the median age, but there's an error bar associated with each of those. So the Sterling, the Great Bang, Big Bang, they call it a Cahokia Timpakatat, is 1050. And this is when everything changes architectural.
Yeah,
Sterling
they ripped
phase,
down the whole city and built a new one.
yeah, Sterling phase is considered 1100 AD to 1200 AD. Then 1200 is the boundary in the archaeological record to the Sand Prairie and Moorhead and the later phases. And that's the decentralization beginning and the so-called decline. So we show the disturbance layer with errors 1150 to 1220. That's an independent chronology in Horseshoe Lake. That's compared to 1100 to 1200 in the excavations from near Monk's Mound in Cahokia. So with the error, that's why I say it's the disturbance layer is attributed to the Stirling phase, 1100 to 1200. Yeah.
And that sounds very tight. That sounds like it jives nicely with the previous archaeology that's suggesting that the city was almost completely abandoned by 1250.
Yeah, and so then that's the question, is exactly the abandonment. I think the feeling now is it's like totally abandoned by like 1350. There's some later dates, even some of the old Palisade Wall dates get closer to 1300. And so it's,
Really?
yeah, if you have the paper up and you can look at the Palisade Wall end dates, it's the red distribution. Note that it's very close to 1300. So they could have been building Palisade walls up until 1300.
That's a change in what I had read. That's good stuff. I don't think I had that second paper. I think I had the
It's a
one.
newish, it's like the last, the recalibration of those dates, because the Palisade Wall dates were totally off.
So let me ask you another question of curiosity, which has got to be in your wheelhouse. The other part of North America that was severely impeded by droughts is the American Southwest. And to our understanding, we have one that's pretty ugly right around this time period, like 1130 is when Chaco Canyon's abandoned. And then sometime in the late, we get another huge one that results in the Pueblo world totally migrating to different parts and clustering around the big rivers to survive. How does this jive with the stuff you're coming up with the Mississippians? Are these time periods pretty similar?
Yes, very, very similar. That's during the so-called medieval climate anomaly to Little Ice Age transition. And it was a volatile climate across North America. The exactly what happened in individual regions is different, and the exact timings, decades, are different. But it does seem to be that about 1100 to 1400, or 1200 to 1400, was a pretty volatile period for climate in North America.
And I guess, like, as you say, I'm not a meteorologist either, but every time there's a drought somewhere, the quantity of rain didn't disappear, it moved.
Hmm.
So there's an equal and opposite amount of rain falling harder somewhere. For every drought we have a flood somewhere else.
Exactly.
Or is that stupid to say? Is that oversimplistic?
I mean, in the long term, that's true. That's exact. The atmosphere can only hold so much water vapor, and it's based on temperature and the volume of air. And so when it'll rain out before it takes up anymore. So yeah, if you have a dry area, it's going to be made up somewhere else, and things move around like that. So that makes sense. That checks out.
And it wouldn't be a hypothesis breaker to say, like, well, why was this region dry for this period of time and this region was dry at a different period of time if it was a American phenomena, because this it moves in a sine wave kind of pattern.
Well, yeah, exactly the climate change is not, you can't think of it as homogenous in any way, and the teleconnections and the forcings behind that act differently depending on where you are. And you're talking about the jet stream becoming more sine wave, like we call that meridional versus zonal circulation. Sometimes the jet stream wobbles a lot more, goes up and down meridians, and so moisture goes up and down. When it's more zonal, it doesn't do that, it goes straight. And things like that on an interannual basis have a big impact. Like El Ninos affect those kind of things, and those have a big impact on year to year weather. Large long term trends are going to be hard to discern for any society, obviously including our own.
Another interesting factor to this is, I love it when somebody like you comes up with a whole new data set that we can contemplate and put into our models of what the hell happened. But, you know, for better or worse, what we s- we still believe that Cahokia was the start of something huge. Even if it fell apart, even if its environment degraded and they had to abandon it, it is I think in Palkatek's words, the primordial city. Whatever they did there stuck for the next centuries. Mississippian way of life takes over. And a lot of the traits that we see from Cahokia are absolutely pasted one to one to these new cities that'll develop all the way through.
100%. And Chunky, the first evidence
Chunky's
for
a
it.
huge one. Actually, that's my next YouTube video. I've got a chunky video coming out that I'm talking about Cahokia starting that as well.
Hmm. And picture this. Imagine Cahokia wasn't chosen because it's good for growing corn, but it was flat and it was good for playing chunky. And they came from everywhere to play the chunky, and the plaza was built around it. Then they decided to put some mounds by it. Then they decided, oh yeah, that plaza is really nice. Put a wall around it so we could play chunky while everyone out here is starving. And the Western people would be like, "What are you doing?" And it was essentially a sport they created everything for.
You know, you say it like it's a farce, but actually, I mean, never underestimate the power of sports to bond society. I
Hmm.
think Cahokia knew that. I think that was a program to get people excited to participate in this new civilization revolution. Chunky played a huge role.
Tim Pocketat's book enlightened me on that. His short book, like America's Great City on the Mississippi. It's a small one by Penguin Publisher Short.
Yeah, that little orange one. I've got it somewhere nearby me. Oh, look at there.
If you have it, you could just show people. So they talks about Chunky in there, and
Little orange
it
side.
blew my mind that in the historical period, people that had seen Chunky being played by the Midwestern tribes saw people lose their whole life savings. They would gamble like their horses away on this game. They came from far and wide to watch Chunky, and great Chunky players reached huge social statuses.
And gambling.
Gambling was huge.
Gambling is a tried and true way to make somebody literally in your debt.
So it was really, really cool. And to end our conversation, I want to maybe shift gears to talk about somebody that I admire that you got to meet. And I want to talk about what was it like to meet Lex Friedman? And you went down to his studio. How was that?
It was great. Lex is a good guy. I really respect his intellectual curiosity. He is endlessly curious about every aspect of human consciousness, our human experience. I honestly, I'm not a big internet guy, so I didn't know who he was. But I said, sure, I'll come talk to you. And I only realized afterwards what a big deal he is.
Hmm.
But the whole thing took place in his apartment in Austin. It was amazing to see what a one man show he is too.
He's a
Some podcasts I show up to, there's a whole staff of people doing things, but Lex's magic is almost completely a one man show as far as I could see. It was in his apartment, it was set up in his living room with the kind of curtains and things curated behind, but it was two kind of like the old school 35 millimeter cameras and him on one side of the table and me on the other. It was all, live. I saw the final product, and that was pretty much it from, start to finish. There was a moment where we took a break for going to the bathroom. There was a moment where his girlfriend stumbled downstairs from his bedroom and said, "Hey, anybody want Starbucks? I'm going to go get some Starbucks." But other than that, it was really just, me and him in his living room. And I found it fascinating. And he was so thorough. Sometimes, I've been on a lot of podcasts now, but in part thanks to Lex, because a lot of people saw what I could do there. But he gave me I think it was an 8-page outline that he had written himself. He had seen all my great courses stuff. And this was incredibly thorough. I mean, I knew that we were going to talk about the Americas, but I didn't realize we were going to talk about them for 3.5 hours based on a 8-page document he had made himself that was just, you know, every curious question he had regarding what I had said in great courses. I I
gosh.
enjoyed the experience, and I have a lot of respect for him.
I I know he's intense. That's why I like him. He lets the people talk. He's really thorough. but he put together, I do research before each of these, and I try to stay within my wheelhouse, relatively speaking. And he, talking to an archaeologist, I know he's a PhD in like robotics and electrical engineering.
Right, so far out of
So
his
far.
lane, but he really did his homework. I mean, he had nonstop intelligent questions and thoughts.
I saw, it was maybe your episode or one similar, where he was asking about the LIDAR of the big Amazon cities they found in the jungle. And the guest was explaining, like, yeah, we can like map these with LIDAR. And he was like, what? And I can't believe this. This is unbelievable. And I was like, bingo, like a light bulb went off in my head. And I was like, someone on the internet needs to work on these earth science, geology, archaeology studies, like these LIDAR papers from the Amazon. But there was a need. When I saw Lex questioning that with his background, and he knows so much that he knew so little about pre-Columbian archaeology, and he was so fascinated by it, that I was like, there's a need for this online. And this is something I think maybe I could bring to the table, because I have a very interdisciplinary background. So I'm able to kind of ask questions, know what to ask that the public wants to hear, to try to maybe make it a more approachable with the way, make it more approachable for someone to understand. So yeah.
I agree. I think you have a very good style here, and you have a broad range of experiences. We really do need guys like you, and I dare say me, to represent. We need, more people in the vein of Carl Sagan that are out there being, science explainers, science communicators. We are communicating through this amazing new venue for humankind to share and express and learn, but it runs the danger of getting hijacked by a whole bunch of nonsense too. And the thing is that the people that are making a buck on the internet are way the heck ahead of honest scientists like you and I. We got to up our game. We're getting, just tsunamied
Mhm.
by all this misinformation, and some of us are back on our heels and fighting, but I think we need to find a way to take the steering wheel on this conversation. But it takes charismatic people like yourself to compete with what's already been assembled in terms of the I don't like the term pseudo archaeology. I think you know it's disrespectful from the beginning of that term, but whoever those guys are, they they own the space.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think, like, you're saying some people go back on their heels. I've noticed that a lot of academics, especially ones that are in the generations older than me, they want nothing to do with YouTube. I get ghosted by some people that I want to bring on the podcast. The ones that have responded, a couple of them have made note that they want to have nothing to do with YouTube or social media, and they just want to stay with books, peer-reviewed papers, and not talking to anybody. Maybe that's the way they want to do
And presto, they become the past they study.
it. Mhm.
This is the way of the world. Millions and millions of people, mostly younger folks, are learning through this medium. And this is where we need to be. We need to, not stick to our old ways. We need to go to where the audience is. And that's where you are. And thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for coming on. And I think having, I was one of those people too, but Lex Friedman and you and other Andrew Huberman, they showed me like that this could be a powerful tool. Like you're saying, this is where the audience is. This is where people learn. A lot of people that are retired can't afford college. They go to YouTube to learn. And if there's no good content on there, what are they going to learn from? The people trying to make a buck, the people that can't even cover my research correctly. And yeah, so for
And
those,
it's a big wide world. There's a place for those guys too. We just, you know, we need to be a voice in the conversation, and refusing because it's YouTube or Ancient Aliens or whatever the heck it is. If we're educators, refusing to be part of the conversation is an automatic fail.
well, Ed, Thank you so much for joining me on my channel. It's been wonderful to talk to you after watching so many of your videos and listening to your voice. So it's good having you.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me. I appreciate it. And thanks for getting the word out about my little corner of the internet.
And I'll make sure to send you the new paper from Cahokia when it's out, if you're interested, and you can take a look and you could see this new
Please
idea.
do. I absolutely am.
All right, Ed, well, take care. Bye.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.